COVID was a very special crisis and very different from other recessions we had. One important distinction is that many people were actually able to save more during the pandemic than typically in a recession. What happens is that people, they draw down their savings, they spend their savings, and they end the crisis with less wealth than they started it. Whereas during COVID, you just couldn't spend your money. So especially if you were like some office worker who could work from home and could continue earning their salary, but you couldn't go out to have fancy dinners anymore, you couldn't travel anymore, you were actually able to save a lot more money than you would normally do. That certainly had an effect on inflation, and that then there was kind of this perfect storm by having this increased demand, because once the pandemic was over, people were like, now I can finally spend all that wealth that I built up. And on the other hand, we still had massive supply issues, because the way supply chains were under stress, given the different COVID regulations, the reduction in travel across the world, and all of these things, chip shortages and many things contributed to that.
Which I still think we're still suffering from to an extent. I haven't looked at it recently, but I think we're still suffering from it particularly.
Yeah. So these things came together, and basically people wanted to buy more things, and at the same time it was harder to produce these things, and then naturally things became more expensive. Then there was also the labor market reacting. Demographics might play a role in the sense that some people might have been close to retirement, then COVID hit and they were not able to work anymore, and then maybe they decided to retire early. Also, many people maybe switched industries, like especially in the service industry. People were not able to work as a chef or as a server, so they maybe started working in other industries, and then once these restaurants could open again, it was very hard for them to find workers. So that, on top of the supply issues I mentioned, this was another reason to increase costs, and then this had to be passed on to prices. So
exactly. And it's like I say, it's a very unique financial crisis in that standpoint, right? Because for all intents and purposes, and I think we're actually I think businesses are actually quite fortunately for the economy, we're starting, at least office-based white-collar work, we're starting to look at more agile working and working from home, and some other, and particularly I know that they're moving out from very densely populated areas such as London, for example. I know, for example, this is when I was at university, I think PwC came and gave a talk and basically said, look, currently 60% of our activity is currently inside London, but in the next 5 years, it's going to be 65% outside of London. And predominantly they were doing that obviously for self-interested reasons, but quite frankly London's a very expensive, for think of all the rental prices of property and things like that are in London, and for all intents and purposes, if you have people doing mostly administrative work that you could do from a laptop anywhere, why would you place those individuals in those places, as opposed to, let's say, Birmingham, for example, that's the lowest cost of living, and so you can pay less. So there were already businesses, particularly white collar work, that were already doing that. And I think that played into potentially some working from home, and that potentially a lot of firms like that were able to adjust to this specific financial crisis more than other industries. Now, this is obviously very different. That's very isolated to white collar service sector jobs, as opposed to, say, primary sector, secondary sector, manufacturing, or agriculture, for example, where you just have to be on site, right? But even in that scenario, it's not like they were actually stopped from doing so. It was just policy in order to essentially prevent virus spread. Once a vaccine had been found and sort of implemented, or things like masks and things like that, people could almost immediately go back out at the exact same efficiency. There wasn't any sort of loss of skills or knowledge and all that kind of thing as well. And I say it's a very unique financial crisis in that standpoint. I think the UK, quite frankly, had the fastest rate of GDP growth, and I think I've seen it, at least in my lifetime. Sort of the year after the pandemic was like 7.5%, which I don't think I've ever seen in the UK have that for a long period of time. But it's because it was the industries themselves weren't nearly as detrimented as where they were, let's say, in a housing of the financial crisis, in that sense, where banks go bust, people lose their savings, and that has a real impact on the economy. I guess part of that as well is that allowed that to happen is like things like the furlough scheme that was funded through monetary policy, because businesses are able to stay open because quite frankly they need to pay rent and things like that, and that's very important. I think, and I don't think I've met many individuals that say it was that none of that should have occurred. I think some, at least from what I've gathered, is that we went a bit, there was almost too much use of it though. The level of extent of printing X amount of money, I think it was something like sort of an extra quarter of the current money supply was basically printed, right? Which is a hell of a lot. And when you look at that, seemed like a very short-term solution to a problem that did not take into account the longer-term effects.